Purosky, and I am presenting on my lecture recital on women composers of solo bassoon repertoire. So I would like to start out by just highlighting the scarcity of bassoon solo repertoire in comparison to other instruments in general, such as the normal sixth grade instruments like clarinet, flute, trumpet, trombone. All those instruments in comparison to bassoon have more repertoire present than bassoon. And the main reason for that is due to the complexity of bassoon and the lack of literature present. And in a fantastic quote from William Waterhouse, the author of the book Bassoon, he states, "Little literature, both in terms of quantity and quality, was written for the instrument because aristocrats were not willing to learn such a difficult instrument, and thus composers are not attracted to the bassoon." So as a composer, what you need to do is you need to be able to understand the basics of an instrument, such as their limitations. For example, knowing the lowest note and the highest note that an instrument can play are very important. And knowing basic fingerings or basic general things about fingerings, like, for example, if you're a composer and you're composing a very fast portion in your music, and you want to make sure that the instrument is able to be played in that way. For example, on the bassoon, if you had two alternating notes and the notes were from all fingers down, all fingers up, then you are stuck with the limitations of how fast I can open and close my hand, and that's much slower than me moving 2 or 3 fingers. So as a composer, you have to take those into account because you want your musicians to be able to play your music. And the problem with this is there's not a lot of literature available to inform composers of these. Even looking back on all my life playing bassoon, I remember looking for fingering charts, and fingering charts were hard to find for the bassoon that were like, here is a straightforward, this is what the fingering for A is. There's just so many things out there and it's confusing, but if you're a clarinetist and you're looking up a fingering chart, there are a dime a dozen. You can find a set fingerings easily. For the bassoon, it's not that easy. And that just shows why bassoon repertoire is so scarce. And while bassoon solo repertoire is a minority, bassoon solo repertoire by women is even more scarce. And one of my favorite examples is Clara Schumann. Clara Schumann lived from 1819 to 1896. She was a prodigal pianist and composer. And she was a pianist and composer that was highly praised by Frederick Chopin and Franz Liszt, who are themselves well-known, famous pianists and composers. But she was held nowhere near their regard until 200 years after the fact. So about 100 some years after her death, she finally started getting praise, while Franz Liszt and Frederick Chopin got praise while they were alive. And that begins to show the gap between women composers and male composers. Another fantastic example is Fanny Mendelssohn. She used her brother's name, Felix Mendelssohn, to publish her works, to get her works out there, because she knew that if she tried publishing under her name, it would be very unlikely for her music to get played and for her music to be heard. So she had to bite the bullet, essentially, and put a male pseudonym, which was her brother's name, out there just to get her stuff heard and played and listened to. And this comes down to a lot of the societal pressure that women faced during these times, and that societal pressure pushed for women to only focus on being a wife and a mother and nothing else. For example, Clara Schumann, it's almost upsetting because when she went back to rank herself in like a letter to one of her family members, she was listing her attributes, and she listed her piano skills and her composition skills dead last. So it kind of showed how society beat her down to believe that she wasn't the prodigy that she was. And it kind of just shows how society treated women at that time. And the main reason for all of this is that it was said that women didn't have the capacity or the mental capacity for music, that they could only focus on being a wife and a mother, and doing anything besides that was too much, which left any compositions by women to be looked at as not even worth the time to look at. So that just shows the big gap between women composers and male composers. And the reasons for no great women composers goes back to societal expectations, which I just mentioned, lack of acceptable education or encouragement. So this means like women weren't pushed to be educated in music. They weren't pushed to explore their talents. They were pushed to prepare to be a wife and a mother. And I mean, some females during this time went above that and persevered above that, but most didn't. Most didn't have that encouragement. But one of the most pivotal is the lack of advertisement and lack of exposure. And what I mean by this is music is a funny thing. So you have to music has to get out there, it has to be played, and then it's finally heard. But for music to even get played, it has to be advertised. People have to hear about it to want to play it, and then for people to hear it. And if you're not getting talked about, your music's not getting played, then no one's hearing it. Your music is just primarily staying ink on paper. And this shows in scholar Eugene Gates' quote in his article, Why Have There Been No Great Women Composers? He states, it's nothing to do with the lack of quality output produced by women, but rather a lack of representation in textbooks and music history. The myth of women's innate creative inferiority in music is fueled by the fact that achievements of female composers have been largely excluded from standard music history textbooks. So if you think back to any music history class that you've ever taken, women composers are rarely mentioned. Looking back on classes that I've taken, I could maybe list one out of all of the other composers we talked about, like Beethoven, Bach, Handel, Schoenberg, Hindemith. I remember all these composers, but I don't recall any women composers. They just weren't talked about. And as a musician, it's very important to know the composer, to hear about the composer, because then it's more likely for me to play their music, because I will be able to understand the composer's point of view, understand their purpose of their piece, understand who they are, their style, and better play their music. If I know nothing of a composer, I'm more likely to pick the composer that I do know about so I can be a better musician. And that's what women composers had to face, the fact that no one's reading about them, no one's knowing them, and it's just more likely for their music to remain ink on paper rather than what it should be. And this then falls back to the fact that musical arts and the arts in general are behind in women exposure in comparison to society itself. And the best comparison I want to bring up is the women's suffrage movement was from 1848 to 1917. And when I bring in other arts such as novels, fantastic novelists like the Bronte sisters, Charlotte Bronte, she used pseudonyms for her novels to get out there and to be read, because she knew if she used her actual name, the likelihood of her novel being read was very minimal. So she was forced to use a male pseudonym to get her stuff heard, or not heard, but read. And this was in 1870, so this is roughly 30-ish years after the women's suffrage movement is already occurring, where expectations are already switching, and life as a woman is already changing. But novelists were still forced to have to do this to get their stuff read. Another prime example would be a German Impressionist painter named Maria Sillana. She made a fantastic piece in 1893, and it didn't become significant until 1981. And that's long after the women's suffrage movement even occurred. And she didn't get any recognition until years after her death, which sounds like Clara Schumann. So the arts you see how they're all wrapped up within each other, and how they're just slightly behind society itself. Which then brings me back to bassoon repertoire. And what I have listed here are what the first bassoon solo repertoire by women were, and it's actually debated between two. So the first one is Hilda Sastad, who was a Danish composer, who composed a bassoon and piano solo piece in 1923. And the other one would be Ruth Crawford Seeger, who wrote diaphonic suites for bassoon and cello in 1941. It's debated because Hilda Sastad, it was said in numerous dissertations that she was the first, and she composed a bassoon and piano solo piece in 1923. But after loads of research, I could never find what the piece was called, what the piece was, what style it was, anything about the piece in general, besides the fact that a bassoon and piano solo piece existed. Which is why it's argued that Ruth Crawford Seeger's Diaphonic Suites for Bassoon and Cello in 1941 is actually the first bassoon solo repertoire by a woman composer. I was actually originally going to play the Diaphonic Suites for Bassoon and Cello, but due to COVID-19, I was not able to adequately prepare for it or play with a cellist, and which makes me very sad because I wanted to show kind of the evolution of female composers from the beginning to currently, because the pieces I'm playing today are more current. Which brings us to contemporary music. So something I want to highlight here right off the bat is most of any woman composers, any of their repertoire right now is contemporary. And that does not mean that there was no women composers that were romantic, baroque, classical. It just means that their music remained ink on paper. They used male pseudonyms, but they're hard to find. And the reason why we see a bunch of women composers in contemporary music is because that's the current music period we have right now. And right now is when women are getting more exposure in the musical world. So it doesn't mean that there wasn't women composers back in the classical period, the Baroque period, the Romantic. It just means that they struggled. They weren't able to get their music out there. And to this day, we're still unearthing women composers. And after much thought, I thought this would be a fantastic thesis project for someone in the future. It's definitely beyond the scope of this presentation, but it would be very interesting to unearth all these women composers that hid behind pseudonyms or their music that just never got out there, because I feel like we're missing a huge chunk of the past by the fact that no one played them and no one's talking about them. But back to contemporary music, some characteristics include fewer lyrical melodies than the music of former periods, dissonant harmonies, complex rhythms, percussiveness, greater use of woodwind, brass, and percussion than in earlier music periods, and the use of synthetic and electronic sounds. So the main point and the main takeaway I want you all to get from this talk is, within this lecture recital, I will highlight two contemporary pieces by female composers that are just as complex, tonal, and stylistic as any contemporary piece composed by a well-known male composer, to further prove the importance of exposure and attitudes toward the different sex. And for today, I'm specifically going to be discussing and playing Colored Stones by Jenni Brandon, and Sonata for Bassoon and Piano by Nancy Galbraith. So the first piece I'm going to discuss is going to be Colored Stones by Jenni Brandon, which was composed in 2014. This piece is a contemporary piece that's 3 movements, and it's unaccompanied for solo bassoon, with three movements called Smokey Quartz, Lapis Lazuli, and Tiger's Eye. This piece was originally composed for the Bassoon Chamber Music Composition Competition, which is a competition that has the purpose to increase repertoire for the bassoon, to help in the creation of new cutting-edge music, and to help in the distribution of these pieces in musicians and the public by creating opportunities for access, such as live performance, the publishing of works, and recordings. To dive a little bit deeper into each movement, I have a picture present too, as well, so you can get more of a visual of what each stone is. But Jenni Brandon has a purpose for each movement, and it's as follows. For Smokey Quartz, it's an incredibly grounding stone. The smoky brown stone transforms and diffuses negative energy. The bassoon changes from a sense of grounding to playfulness, exploring this balance of energy. In the end, it always finds its way back to telling the story of the grounding quality of the stone. Lapis Lazuli is prized for its colors. This deep blue stone was used by kings and queens in paintings and ceremonial robes. Believed to help foster truthful expression, communication, it supports the immune system and brings peace. The bassoon explores the luxurious blue color, mixing in flashes of gold found in the stone. And then lastly, Tiger's Eye. Tiger's Eye is a golden brown to deep red stone that is very grounding and can bring luck and ward off evil. The bassoon is sometimes protective in seeing, moving quickly to remove the look of the evil eye, and other times moving dreamily through an ancient landscape of protective energy. So today I'm going to be comparing Jenni Brandon's piece to William Osborne's Rhapsody for Bassoon. So I've actually had the pleasure of playing both pieces, And I've definitely noticed that there's a similar approach to both of them, although I believe Brandon highlights the bassoon's most beautiful notes and complements the bassoon's abilities more, which could be due to the fact that William Osborne's Rhapsody for Bassoon was composed in 1956, and Brandon's was composed in 2014, which could be highlighting the fact that there's more literature now than there was in 1956, and or the ability to use the internet and having more applicable resources to why she has better notes for the bassoon. But it also could be just how I feel playing it, and it could be the bassoon that I'm playing that has notes that complement my bassoon. But I believe the audience would find a piece more beautiful than the other. And the three factors I'm going to be comparing are numerous complex chromatic runs, rhythmic difficulty, and differing in tempo changes between the two. So the first comparison I have here is the use of chromaticity and complex chromatic runs. So they both use them throughout both of their pieces, and they use them to create a lot of instability within them. For example, within the first and second movements, there's lots of moments of stability and moments of instability. And this chromaticity definitely brings instability until it gets to the landing point. Kind of like going up a roller coaster. That's where mentally we're unstable and we're freaking out the entire time. But then as soon as you go down the hill, that's where the fun part is. That's where you find more stability, I guess. And that's probably the best way I could ever explain like the chromaticity, especially ascending chromatic lines that get to that grounding point. And they both highlight this equally well throughout their pieces. The next part I want to look into is the rhythmic complexity. They both use really complex rhythmic structures, such as moving away from just using quarter notes, whole notes, eighth notes. They're moving into using 5-tuplets, triplets. As you can see here, you see the 5-tuplets, and they use variety. They don't just use 5-tuplets. They go from eighth, quarter, 5-tuplet, and then Brandon over here is using 5-tuplets and 4/16 notes, 4/16 notes, and then moving back into triplets. They both use variety in rhythms equally, and they do them equally well. And then lastly, I want to highlight the pushing and pulling of the different tempo changes. So as you go through, for example, in the Osborne, we are at a tempo that is pressing on chasing, which is what incalzando means. And as we're pressing on and having this chasing feeling, we're then getting to a poco rit, which slows down. So you're pushing forward, then you're pulling back. You're pushing forward, you're pulling back. And Brandon does this probably even more frequently than the Osborne does. And she does it within sometimes a bar or two. For example, we have the odd tempo, so we retardandoed right here, slowed down, and then we went back to odd tempo, and then retardandoed again. So it was like, we're going forward, up, we're coming back, we're going forward, coming back, kind of pushing and pulling like you would with taffy. You pull taffy out, you push it back together, and that's kind of what they both highlight throughout their pieces. So without further ado, I am going to play Colored Stones by Jenni Brandon for you. I'm just going to play one or two notes before I get into it. Especially the differing in tempo changes and the pushing and pulling and kind of the slowing down, the stopping, and all of that. And right now we're going to take a 30-minute intermission due to COVID-19, so I hope to see you guys back for the final half of my lecture recital in 30 minutes. Thank you. discuss the Sonata for Bassoon and Piano by Nancy Galbraith. This piece is a classical contemporary genre, so it kind of highlights a lot of sonata form, but it has all the contemporary techniques where you're not really, there's a lot of disjunction present, which is not very typical of classical. And this piece is 3 movements long, and it includes movement 1, which is lilting and lively, movement 2, which is a meditative serenity, and movement 3, which is fast and sprightly. More specifically, movement 1, Galbraith describes it as a lilting and lively in nature with jazzy syncopated interplay between the bassoon and the piano. Some of these rhythmic materials employ mixed meters and hemiolas, while the harmonic and melodic materials make use of whole tone scales and polytonality. Movement 2, the piano opens movement 2 slowly with a series of polytonal and cluster chords to establish an air of meditative serenity. The bassoon enters with a sighing motif in the high register, gradually expanding to a broader expression of the theme, supported by frenetic arpeggios in the piano. The movement concludes with a return to a mood of tranquil, meditative melancholy, and wistful peace. And in the final movement, she describes it as the fast and sprightly final movement is played, for the most part, in a light staccato and dance-like perpetual motion. The 2 voices again engage in playful, syncopated exchanges throughout, and a brief cadenza provides momentum for the reeling conclusion. I am going to be comparing Galbraith's sonata to Alexander Tonsman's sonatine for bassoon and piano. Both of these pieces are well-known, but this piece is a more well-known 3-movement piece, and it's similar to the Galbraith because it highlights the classical nature of the sonata form, while also having rhythmically complex motifs and a jazz-like nature to the piece. The Tonsman was written in 1923, and Tonsman was a Polish-born French composer and virtuoso pianist of Jewish origins. His 3 movements are very similar in tempo, such as his 3 movements are Allegro con moto, Aria, Largo cantabile, and Scherzo presto, which is similar to the personas that Galbraith is trying to portray, with a moderate tempo for the first movement, a very slow second movement, and then a very fast forward-moving final movement. And they both highlight those factors. And I am going to then compare. My first comparison is going to be within the first movements of both pieces, and it's the highlighting of the complexity and the jazz-like nature of them. And you can see a lot of the jazz-like nature with the Tonsman, with his slurring over the bars. It's kind of the offbeat nature, and a lot of the articulation kind of gives that persona as well. While in the Galbraith, she uses a lot of different time signatures, moving between duple and triple, moving between 4/4 and 9/8, and it gives that very jazz-like nature. It's not exactly jazz, but it has that jazz-like sense. And both of them do that equally well. When you listen to them, it's a very similar style present. The second comparison I want to do is the modulation of character within the first movement. So the first pictures that I showed you had a lot of articulations present and a lot of accents and staccatos, while this, for example, the Tonsman, the Menemoso, moves to more slurs, longer notes, so longer note values and slurs to make a more melodic sense to it. In the Galbraith, it might be a little more obvious with the fact that she uses a bunch of staccatos and accents, and then moves to longer, like, dotted half notes and slurs, and you can hear it pretty well when you listen to both pieces. The fact that all of a sudden we're, like, fast and choppy kind of in the beginning, and it's jazz-like, and then it goes to this very smooth feel in the middle of the movement before returning back to that upbeat, staccato, accented nature. And then the final movement, the final comparison is about the final movement and that forward-moving nature that both of them have. And one of the main techniques that they both utilize is the use of a repetitive pacemaker note, such as these 16th notes present in both pieces. And this kind of brings in the nature of, like, a train, and it's chugging along, and when you have those repetitive notes, it's very easy to almost push the train a little too much to near derailment, which, when you're comparing it to the piano being played, the piano is also playing quite differently and opposite of the bassoon, and it's very easy for the bassoon here with these repetitive notes to essentially derail the train that's going along. with the repetitive nature of them. But they're utilized as a pacemaker to kind of bring that forward motion to the piece and for the final conclusion. So without further ado, I'm going to play the Galbraith Sonata. Factors that I was describing in the first part of this half. and especially the forward movement of the last movement and kind of that final push towards the end. And I would like to just conclude that composing is not about the gender that you are, nor the amount of exposure that you get. It is about the music that you create, and despite the fact that a lot of women composers never got the exposure that they deserved, it doesn't mean that they didn't create good music. And I would just like to thank everyone on my committee, Christopher Kantner and Dr. Arthur Campbell, especially Victoria Olson, who is my bassoon professor over the last 4 years, helping me grow as a musician and as a person. And I'd like to thank my friends and family for showing up today, and Nate for doing all of the business that's around here. Basically running the Performing Arts Center and the music department. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.